All right, guys, we want to make sure that we get these x-axis and y-axis interpretations correct. So let's take a look at some of the ones that were given to me and see how you did in kind of grading or interpreting the pages that were given to me. All right, here we go. So first of all, the x-axis is that proportion of the products that they surveyed. So the proportion of all the surveyed products in the U.S. that are the automobiles, electronics, food, and oil. So those are what they surveyed. Okay, so it's the proportion of the total, the marginal. But then the y-axis is the conditional. So it's the proportion of each industry sampled. So it's the proportion of the automobiles that are made in US, Japan, Germany, France, and Britain, or imported from. Okay? So it's the proportion of each industry is the denominator that are made in the nation is the numerator. All right, so here comes some actual student examples. So this first person says, the proportion of each industry made by a particular nation. So it is the proportion of each industry. So I think that denominator was clear. Made by a particular nation. Okay, so I think that was a good one. That one covered what it needed to and said what it needed to about the y-axis. This next one, the proportion of how much is contributed to each industry by each nation. So that one was pretty, that was difficult. I mean, that one was kind of questionable. I went ahead and I think I probably would have given credit for that one, although it was kind of awkward. I think it was really that how much was contributed to each industry kind of says that that industry is the denominator by each nation. Okay, so I think that is meaning that that's the things. Okay. The proportion of the number of products in each industry to the percent made by each nation. Okay, so this person was good to get in the proportion and the percent. But when you were saying, I don't know which one of those things is the denominator. This really kind of sounds like a ratio of 2 to 3 or that kind of thing where you would say industry to nation. And in that case, what's the denominator? What's the numerator? We don't know. So this seems like they're relating those things to each other, but there's not a denominator or a numerator. Okay. All right. Next, here we have the first problem is saying the proportion of that nation that makes that industry compared to the total. I don't know what this compared to the total is. And also then when they say proportion of that nation that makes that industry. Okay, so the proportion of that nation, that's like saying the proportion of the U.S. that makes oil or where they get the oil, where they or the automobiles or the electronics. Okay, so yeah, so the proportion of the nation. Okay. And I don't know really what the numerator is, and I don't know what this compared to the total is. So that's definitely a problematic. I would not have given credit for that response. Okay. The amount of each nation. Okay. So that's unclear. Amount of each nation makes from each type of industry. Almost sounds like nation is the denominator, but I don't know. It's unclear. Plus, it talks about amount rather than proportion. So that's another ding against that one. Okay, so the y-axis interpretation, the specific nation population of each industry. So it is of each industry. So I think that the denominator is industry, but the nation population is total. I mean, what is that saying? I don't know. Okay, so that one's a no. Here's another y-axis one. The proportion of each nation within the different industries. So that sounds like that we are, it's the proportion of each nation. So it almost sounds like the proportion of what Britain makes and then that out of the industry. So it's almost like a double denominator, the proportion of each nation within the industry. I don't know. It's unclear. I can't tell. But for sure, I do know that whenever they said the proportion of each nation, so that's like the proportion of Japan that makes these things, the proportion of the French that make these things. So that makes the denominator the nation, not the proportion of the industry. All right, the frequency at which each nation occurs. So that's the y-axis. That's not indicating a conditional situation at all. That's just like the overall total nation amount. Okay, so that's not correct because it's not addressing the conditional component that the y-axis does. The amount, again, is a bad thing, that the different industries are found in each nation. So again, I think that's each nation is the denominator. It also states the amount, not proportion. Okay, how about this one? The proportion of that nation that made that specific industry. Again, that sounds like the proportion of Germany products that make automobiles. Okay. All right. So they switched the numerator and the denominator. Here's another y-axis interpretation. The proportion of each industry made in the countries US, Japan, France, and Germany. Yeah, that sounds good actually, except for they kind of forgot off Britain. If they had put Britain in there, then it would have been correct because it's the proportion of each industry. So the proportion of each industry made in those particular countries. Okay. The proportion of each industry in the United States. Oh, see, this is an x-axis interpretation. So that is the overall, the marginal. So the proportion of each industry in the United States, and that is the total surveyed was the denominator, and the numerator was each type of industry. So that was what the x-axis did represent. Okay, so hopefully that cleared up some of those axis interpretations.